Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending with where we are. Friends, I welcome you to this afternoon that we're meeting. Let us pray. Merciful God, you who heard the cries of the enslaved Africans, hear now the prayers of their descendants. We remember this day before you the souls of the millions who died along the way as they were being transported across the Atlantic. We remember too the local African communities where daily lives were disrupted as communities were torn apart with the forceful removal of their family members. We remember in prayer those who survived and who, in spite of the horrors of enslavement, survived. We give thanks today for their resilience and that they were able to keep the cultural and religious traditions alive while forging new ones as they sought to rebuild their lives. As we lament the horrors of the transatlantic slave trade, we today ask you for strength and courage to confront the legacies that have resulted from this historic crime against humanity. Bring healing to those who, as they recall this period in history, experience and relive the trauma of the past. Bring reconciliation to those who today remain divided because of the bitter fruits that have been born from this historic tree. May difficult conversations be done with a spirit of conviviality so that the words and actions that are done today will lead to much needed healing and restoration of fractured and broken human relationships. We pray for the guidance of the Holy Spirit among us today during this webinar. May our ears be opened as we hear the different presentations of those who will speak to us today. Make of your church today a beacon of light and hope, even as to acknowledge our complicity in the transatlantic slave trade. Forgive us and lead us to be bridge builders as we seek to be ministers of repentance, reparatory justice, and reconciliation motivated by Christ's love. We pray in the name of the triune God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you, friends.
Okay. So
Now,
good day, everyone. My name is Isabel Apaopiri, Deputy General Secretary in the WCC, responsible for public witness and diaconia. And then I'm also responsible for the Pilgrimage of Justice and Peace. I give oversight to the work of the WCC in gender justice, racial justice, and human sexuality. And on behalf of the World Council of Churches, Acting General Secretary, Reverend Professor Yuan Sauka, it is a pleasure for me to welcome you all to Community, Church, State, and Economics of Enslavement, Views from Across the Atlantic online webinar. 25th March is special because we are all invited to commemorate the UN International Day for Remembrance of Victims of Slavery and the Transatlantic Slave Trade. As we are all aware, central to the institution of the transatlantic slave trade was commerce, but also racism made that slavery look desirable and right. The mass removal of Africans across the Atlantic created problems for the communities that were so mercilessly deprived of their productive generations, for the displaced, dislocated, and forcibly transported across the Atlantic, for the indigenous communities that were already resident in the new territories. We want to use this day to start a conversation, bringing together voices from across the Atlantic. The WCC has joined the commemoration of this day because racism has been our concern since the WCC was established in 1948. It is also a programmatic priority for the WCC because of the decision made by the WCC Central Committee in recent times in 2016. Since then, we have had several activities to highlight racial justice, starting with the Racial Justice Solidarity visit to the USA. The establishment of a transversal on overcoming racism starting from 1st July 2021 is WCC's recent effort to coordinate the work on racism. This online event is one of the various webinars we will be organizing on the way to the WCC 11th Assembly in Kassel in Germany in order to prepare the participants of the assembly. And now my responsibility is to introduce to you the moderator for this webinar, Adele Halliday. Adele serves as the anti-racism and equality lead at the National Office of the United Church of Canada. She brings personal passion and a deep dedication to the anti-racism and equality work that she faithfully engages with. An experienced anti-racism educator, workshop leader, and award-winning writer, Adele has been involved in anti-oppression work with churches in Canada and beyond for many years. She's currently a member of the World Council of Churches Reference Group on the Pilgrimage of Justice and Peace. She's also the co-moderator of the WCC Advisory Group on Overcoming Racism. She is a staff resource for the United Churches National Anti-Racism Common Table. She holds a Master of Education and a Master of Theological Studies and is currently studying towards a Doctor of Education. Adele lives in Toronto, Ontario, Canada, with her spouse and their 2 young children. Over to you, Adele.
Thank you for the warm welcome, Professor, and welcome to everyone for today's webinar. It is good that you are here to explore the theme of community, church, state, and the economics of enslavement, views from across the Atlantic. And we have an excellent number of people who will be serving on the panel to help us explore this theme. Today, on this United Nations International Day for the Remembrance of Victims of Slavery and the Transatlantic Slave Trade, the United Nations has declared that the theme for 2022 is Stories of Courage, Resistance to Slavery and Unity Against Racism. And today, through our panelists, we'll have many opportunities to share and hear stories along those lines. Today's webinar is going to be exploring the narratives of people of African descent across the Atlantic and how the lives of people of African descent have been shaped by the racist transatlantic slave trade. We'll be hearing from our panelists in a moment. I'm just going to introduce them. If any of you have questions as we go along, please feel free to use the question and answer box in the chat, and we'll weave those into our conversation discussion time near the end after we've heard from all of our panelists. So please let me introduce our 5 panelists, and then we will engage in conversation together. So one panelist is the Reverend Professor Eric New Botri Anim, who is a member of the Presbyterian Church of Ghana and Professor of New Testament Studies, who is living in Accra, Ghana. Another panelist, the Reverend Dr. Peter Crutchley, the Mission Secretary for Mission Development with the Council for World Mission, who is living in Birmingham, United Kingdom. Miss Ayana McCallum is a trained lawyer and member of the Guyana Congregational Union, who's living in Georgetown, Guyana. Miss Marilia Schuler, who is a member of the Methodist Church of Brazil, a former World Council of Churches staff member for the Program to Combat Racism, and is currently a retired missionary living in Cortobia, Brazil. And the Reverend Dr. Karen Georgia Thompson, who is the Associate General Minister for Wider Church Ministries and Operations in the United Church of Christ, who is currently living in New York in the United States of America. So welcome to Eric, Peter, Ayana, Marilia, and Karen Georgia. We are very keen to hear from all of you in conversation today. So let's begin with our first question. So our first question for conversation today is, in what ways were Africans, both remaining on the continent and forcibly transported across the Atlantic, affected by the transatlantic slave trade? So for this first question, let's first hear from Karen Georgia.
Good day to all, and thank you for the opportunity to be present as we gather to remember the transatlantic slave trade and to really spend some time talking about the importance of this moment for African descendant people. The transatlantic slave trade has long been noted in films and books, and the horrific nature of the transatlantic slave trade as an enterprise, I believe, is something that as African people, we need to continue to hold as an issue that needs to be addressed and redressed. There are long-term effects, both for African descendant people in the Americas and for Africans on the continent. And I am thankful for this opportunity in gathering to talk about this collectively and to really think about the comprehensive narratives that we need to carry as a people. First of all, I would point to the human capital that was taken from the continent and has not been acknowledged as an issue in the development of the continent. That is a problem that we need to continue to talk about, because development requires human capital and human resources. Something that was alluded to, which we also don't talk about quite often, is what it meant for people to be separated from their families, taken away, but also what it meant for those who remained to know that their family was taken away with no acknowledgement, no understanding of where they went or what happened to them. One book that I would recommend is Barracoon, which was written by Zora Neale Hurston and actually documents the life of probably one of the last transported individuals into the United States. And he tells his story about actually being taken away from his family, his journey across the Atlantic, and what that meant. So this loss of human capital, I believe, has contributed to the underdevelopment of sub-Saharan Africa, with the depletion of human resources necessary to do the development that was needed. The other piece is that the commodification of African bodies has to be noted in the larger context of colonization and the provision of unpaid labor for the plantocracy, which emerged both in the Americas and on the African continent. And must be acknowledged also as a major part of this problem. So the resources that came from this, from the enslavement of people, actually created a wealth gap, which is still currently present. When you have people who are working for free for generations, you're creating generational cycles that then become hard to break, because in the midst of all of that is the fact that one group of people are amassing wealth at the expense of another group of people. So this wealth gap that we're currently seeing, and the disparities, the economic disparities between African descendant, African peoples, and European descendant people, the fact that this wealth gap is also based on countries, right? So the GDP of European countries versus the GDP of Caribbean, South American, and African and European countries has to be interrogated in light of the transatlantic slave trade, because the wealth that was amassed from the labor of Africans actually helped to build the resources in Europe that we now see has moved from generation to generation. So I think that those are some of the pieces that we need to continue to think about and to interrogate as we begin this conversation about the transatlantic slave trade.
Wonderful. Thank you for that very fulsome answer, Karen Georgia. Very much appreciated. Let's now hear from Marilia on the same question, please. So Marilia, what are your perspectives on this same question? In what ways were Africans affected by the transatlantic slave trade?
Thank you very much, Adele. I am very grateful for the opportunity of participating in this webinar with all of you. And I'm particularly moved by the prayer that Matthewa has prayed with us in the beginning, because I think it's a very important day for us to be remembering those that have died also in the transatlantic slave trade. I believe Karen has pointed out very important elements. But what I would like to do is still to remain on the aspect of what it means, the Middle Passage. So the transatlantic slave trade, this crossing of the Atlantic was called the Middle Passage. And many have named it as floating tombs. In Portuguese, here in Brazil, we have called it tumbeiros. What in fact represent, these words represent the fact that many people have died on the crossing of the Atlantic. And punishment, hunger, disease, trauma, and many other situations have impacted upon those that were in those floating tombs. And what does it mean for us also as people of the Americas, and especially me living in Brazil, is that we have never had the opportunity to cry upon our brothers and sisters, our ancestors that were killed on the crossing of the Atlantic. And so the reason why I wanted to point out about that is because one very meaningful experience in the ecumenical arena that we have had was related to the Mission and Evangelism Conference that happened in Brazil, organized by the World Council of Churches, in which for the first time, people from Brazil and around the world have gathered together at the shore where the slaves were brought in the city of Salvador in Bahia. And I tell you, my friends and all that are participating with us, it was the first time in my whole life that I had the chance to remember those that have crossed the Atlantic, those that survived, but those that died as well. And the grief that came upon me was so powerful because I was there mourning those that have died in the transatlantic slave trade. I was there mourning to those that have given their lives for the abolition of slavery, or those that have continued their struggle. So I wanted to bring this as a testimony. And I can imagine, my friends, what happened to Africa. And because people that were captured in enslavement in Africa, and the families, what happened to their families, the journeys that people went through across the Atlantic. So I wanted to give you this quite emotional response to this, because for us to move ahead, I think we have to contemplate that reality of death of the transatlantic slave trade and death in slavery. And I just want to finalize saying, in Brazil, the legacy, it is said that we had more or less 4.8 million people, enslaved people that were brought to Brazil between the 1500s and the end of when the abolition of slavery. And that is not a small information. We can imagine in the total, it's about, some say 12 million, some say 15 million people that were brought across the transatlantic slave trade. So those are some elements that I wanted to share on this aspect. Thank you. Sorry for taking a little more, I guess.
It's okay. Thank you, Marilia. Thank you very much for your sharing. Let's now hear from Ayana, please, on the same question. So Ayana, what are your perspectives on this question here?
Thank you, Adele. Good morning, everyone. Like Karen and Marilia, I am very pleased and humbled to be participating in this conversation. It's an important conversation because, as my sisters who've gone before me have said, it's important that we remember, not as a story, not as a some past historical moment, but really remember the people who have passed, who were traumatized, and who we have not been able to grieve and mourn collectively as a people. Those are our ancestors. And I believe this conversation is important. In terms of the question, what are the effects? I've lived in my Black skin for 39 years, and I've had personal experience of the effects of what it means to be the descendant of people who were enslaved. And I think that personal experience, as I've been observing myself and also observing as a practitioner of law, which means that you have to observe people and their behavior. And I've been doing that for, intentionally for 16 years. I think the effects are threefold. We lost our identity, first of all. We are not a people who know who we are. That sense of knowing in the world and having clarity of your purpose. Many people of African descent, African descended people, don't have that sense of who they are because of this historical disconnection from their culture, their history. I think the other effect is that it was traumatic, and that is a trauma that we are not allowed to speak about, that has not been healed. So we are carrying all of this pain, past and present, that isn't in any way being healed. And when we make attempts at healing it, we're essentially told, you're bringing up the past, you're getting angry. Why are you even having this conversation? That is the past. And I believe that's a dangerous place to be, to have pain unprocessed and just having to move through life for generations. It's been 400 years plus, and we have not, whether, some of us are trying to do the individual work to heal, but we have not had, I don't believe we have had adequate opportunities to collectively heal as a people, to say what does this mean for us to have experienced this? And there's studies, there's research. Dr. Joy DeGruy has done a whole body of work on post-traumatic slave syndrome, and the effect, that the psychological effect that slavery has had and its impact on some of the experiences we're having around things of, poverty, and just people's individual psychology of how they live their life and how they understand life. I think the third effect for me that I've also been reflecting on is the disruption of memories. The fact that we get told that our history begins with slavery, which is not true. And not only is it just not true, it's a wicked lie. It's just not that it's just not true, it's a lie. So all the memories we had as a people of our greatness that resulted in the pyramids and science and technology and the arts, right? And being essentially teachers, spiritual teachers and teachers of the arts and sciences. We lost that. And we are being told consistently, it's, as a Caribbean child, I grew up, my history, I had to learn that on my own, that African history is more than slavery. So I think for me, those are the three effects. The loss of our identity, the trauma that we continue to experience today, and the fact that our memories individually and collectively is absolutely disrupted. And we now need to do the work to reclaim that.
Thank you, Ayana. Thank you very much. Let's now hear from Eric. Eric, what are your responses to this?
Thank you very much, Adele, and I'm very happy to be asked to contribute to this debate. I, some years ago, taught heritage in Kennesaw State University, and there I realized that as I go through teaching this topic, I realized the faces of the African Americans. They looked at me with some strange eyes. And then one of them came to me and said, "You sold us, now you've come here to come and tell us what?" And there I started realizing that there are certain narratives which really, when we are in Africa, we just gloss over it. And then I realized that we need to go deep and we need to work together on this. And I want to give a quote to just talk about what I want. El Shabazz, he said on one visit to Ghana, he said to us, as people listen to him, he said, and I quote, "I don't feel that I am a visitor to Ghana, in Ghana, or in any part of Africa. I feel that I am at home. I have been away for 400 years, but not of my own volition, not my own will. Our people did not go to America on the Queen Mary. We did not go by Pan-American. We did not go to America on Mayflower. We went in slave ships. We went in chains. We weren't immigrants to America. We were cargo for the purposes of a system that was bent on making profit," unquote. And for me, this shows the kind of dehumanization, disorientation that took place. And you can see from the pain, as you listen to El Shabazz, that there is a lot of pain in realizing that you are coming to a place to give yourself orientation, because for 400 years, there have been disorientation, which came from a common ancestral people who had done that. When you look at how the people were carried, how they went, and what happened when they went there, and the number of years that passed, and all kinds of things. You realize that it has affected the way people saw the Black race. So when we talk about the whole idea was black this thing matters and other things, it came far away from dehumanization, the way people see us as Africans, because of the way the slave trade actually portrayed who we are for so many years. And it has been so difficult to come out of that, because if somebody remembers in his own mind that they are a race of people who had dehumanized them, made them feel they are their commodities, they just things to be used, and they were used. The way people were carried on the ships, packed like sardines, the number of them that died. Sometimes when you read the story about when the slaves are sold, what happens? The inspection of the slave is that they are stripped naked, both men and women, and examined. These are the things that the things that makes us feel that there is a lot that has happened. So there is a dehumanization of our race as Africans, and there's also a disorientation. When I went to Kennesaw, I was disoriented by meeting others, and I couldn't even know how to relate to their stories. So I think that is it. The dehumanization and disorientation is what I'll talk about. Yeah.
Thank you, Eric. Thank you very much. And finally, Peter, let's hear from you in response to this same question, please. Peter.
Adele, thank you for this invitation, and to friends here and to the organizers from the World Council of Churches. Like many white people, I have come late to this struggle and to this debate. A white person conceived in the complacency of white Christian liberalism, that of course I disapprove entirely of racism. And we of course are part of the nation who outlawed enslavement in the intergenerational fantasia that is whiteness. And so I want to acknowledge both I am late to this struggle, and to receive in tenderness and pain the witness that has been shared here in pain and trauma and wrong. And to speak then not to name anything in the context of Africa or African descendant peoples, but to speak of the significance then of the transatlantic slave trade in the generation and building up of the concept of whiteness, and the kind of transformations of that whiteness into many forms that continue to do violence at the same time as making claims that we are somehow about peace, life, civilization. So I want to share in that way with friends here in this space, and answers have already named the particular way that my nation, amongst others, has accrued wealth to itself wrongly and unjustly. And I'm part of the nation whose prime minister went to Jamaica in 2010 and told the people there to just get over it, just forget about it, let's all move on. And of course, my heir to the throne and his wife and consort are currently in the Caribbean expressing shame, and I will maybe say a little more about that in a moment. But it is in this context, I think, to acknowledge how the transatlantic slave trade has particularly formed whiteness deliberately and blackness, that the transatlantic slave trade kind of exposes the occupation of our spirits, our bodies, our lives separately and together as a deliberate act of aggrandizement by people of my history, color, and race and tradition. But I want to share with you just quickly the story of a African descendant enslaved person, part of my organization, Council for World Mission, Kwamina. And I ask Ayana's permission to share his story, as he is the national hero of Guyana. And Ayana is rightly a daughter of his, and in his tradition, I think, as someone fighting for justice. Kwamina was a deacon of the London Missionary Society who wrote to the London Missionary Society to expose the evil of plantocracy, as Karen Georgia was naming a moment ago. And the directors of that organization remained silent. And they told the missionaries that they were sending into the Caribbean, you are to say nothing to aid the slaves in their struggle, but only to offer them the so-called consolation of religion. And so part of our task as a mission organization is addressing this 400 years of silence that our friends here have so eloquently named, even though we are an organization transformed since 1977, but needs to hear again the pain and power and passion of these calls for justice for our past and our present and all the intersections of that. So I'll share a little more in the coming questions, maybe other dimensions of this, but I think it is in this particular way I would like to share how to acknowledge this in the context of the framing, creating of this totalizing whiteness that continues to shape our lives, know our lives, and name us sinfully and wrongly. So Ayana, thank you for this opportunity to share.
Thank you, Peter. And thank you to all of our panelists for exploring responses to this first question. I wonder if we can get all of the panelists on screen just for a moment. So far we've been just exploring this question of in what ways were Africans, those remaining on the continent and forcibly transported across the Atlantic, affected by the transatlantic slave trade. We've heard a great deal from our panelists, particularly the effect on people. So people of African descent in particular, the pain, the trauma, the need for collective grief, the loss of identity, the intergenerational effects. We've heard of how families were ripped apart without opportunities to mourn or grieve, the emotional impact of all of this, the need to lament the many deaths. We've heard of the number of people affected, millions of people in the Middle Passage over hundreds of years. We've heard of course, the racist overtones of all of this. We've heard of pain, disorientation, of the dehumanization, and again, the collective effect of all of this over years. We've also heard about the economic cost, the increased wealth gap, the underdevelopment of the African continent, and again, that effect over generations. And we've heard again of how the ways in which the transatlantic slave trade has formed whiteness and Blackness differently, and how because of the deep systemic nature of this over so many years, it's not something that people of African descent can just get over. So this in response to this first question and much more. So thank you for our panelists for continuing to explore this first question. We have two more questions for our panelists to explore together, and many among you who are listening may also have questions. We'd encourage you to put those into the chat and we'll explore those closer to the end. So for this second round of questions is really around, we started exploring this in some ways, but we'll explore it a bit more. So it's a question around the cumulative cost. So what has been the cumulative cost of the slave trade on Africa and on people of African descent? So we've heard a little bit of that already. We'll have a bit more time to explore this more fully. So question about the cumulative costs. For this first question, let's hear, the second question, let's first hear from Eric, please.
Much. I think the cumulative cost, you can see that a period of 400 years is really very long. And you realize the human capital, as somebody said, about some people say 45 to 50 million people were transported from West Africa alone. And you realize it disrupted development, the economic development of a nation. When you have 50 to 40 million people being carried away, the economic activity, which was farming, so many people were so afraid that they couldn't even go to their farms because they are afraid that if you go too far, you'll be caught. There was no motivation to farm anymore, because if you farmed, maybe by the time the plant will grow, you've been carried away. So the economic this thing, disruption of people's lives, and also the fact that there was a whole mass deportation. This mass deportation created a vacuum. That gap is so difficult to really deal with. Then you also have various communities. Like if you come to Ghana, there are communities that cannot really forget the whole thing about the slave trade. They see themselves as slave market areas, slave rivers, and all sorts of things. And it has created a kind of a stigma around these places. And people are finding it very difficult to really come out of that socially and even psychologically. And I think it is also the whole idea of injustice and corruption. Injustice and corruption in Africa can be blamed on our political, but it started long ago when people were made to feel that you can capture a whole group of people and then try to sell them. You can find a reason for capturing somebody and selling them. So this injustice was created in people's minds, and it continued on, and that cumulative effect is here. And this class system, these are the rulers, and these are the commoners. You can do anything to a common person and go scot-free, you know. And I think that these things have been engraved in our lives, and it has continued on and on. The master and the slave, the king and the common person, and this has really affected both our social, our political life, and our economic life. Thank you.
Thank you, Eric. Let's now hear from Ayana. What would be your responses to the question around the cumulative cost? Ayana, please.
I want to, before I talk about the cost, say that this is a difficult conversation, and I want to acknowledge everyone on the call, including the panelists. This is a difficult conversation to have, but difficult conversations are necessary. You know, it's like a wound, right? You have to, in order to deal with it, in order to heal it, you need to address it. You can't pretend like it's not happening. So I wanted to preface what I'm going to say by saying that the cost, we have been counting the cost for years. You know, the good book says, count the cost. And one of the persons who counted the cost is Guyanese, who I absolutely love, and I believe he's a revered ancestor, Walter Rodney. And he put it simply. He wrote a book called How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. And by extension, that means the Caribbean and every place where African people landed. That was one of the major costs. We have remained underdeveloped for years. So Karen, you know, Reverend Karen Georgia talked about the loss of human capital. It meant that our development, the trajectory of who we are, who we were meant to be as a people, was completely interrupted economically, socially, politically. And that is a major, major, major cost. And somebody needs to take account, as we have been doing as people of African descent, and be responsible for that cost. I think for me, the other cost, and is connected to the whole issue of underdevelopment, is that it cost us our future, right? Everybody, the reason why I believe Black people loved Ryan Coogler's movie, Black Panther and Wakanda, is that Wakanda at least got us thinking about what it would have looked like if slavery hadn't happened. If we didn't have that interruption, what would have Africa looked like today? I love music. It's one of the ways I process and deal with my life. And Damian Marley has a song called with Nas, I think, Nas the rapper from the US. Damian Marley is, of course, Bob Marley's, iconic Bob Marley's son. And they have a song called Land of Promise. And they have this whole rap verse about, you know, Sierra Leone being, you know, the Mecca, and, you know, naming other African countries that would be like the Times Square. So I think the cost for us is that this has costed us, and I say us collectively, our future as a people. And it has also, like I said, it has costed us, we have remained underdeveloped for years. There is also a cost to white people. I can't imagine that it has been easy carrying the memory of the fact that your ancestors perpetuated what is the most, we don't want to count it and compare, but horrific treatment of human beings. And that is a cost. That has to be mentally taxing to carry that in your spirit and in your memory, whether individually as a white person or collectively. So we all have been affected by this. Martin Carter has a poem from Guyana, and he says, all are involved, everybody. There's a cost for us, those of us who live in our Black skins, and there's a cost for those who live in their white skins.
Thank you, Ayana. Thank you very much. Let's hear next from Peter, please. What would be your responses to this question around the cumulative cost?
Thank you for the opportunity again to reflect on this and indeed to follow Ayana's challenge, particularly. I think one of the elements of the transatlantic slave trade's kind of force, spiritually and culturally, in addition to its economic power over 400 years, is the way it has normalized racism and inequality. That, you know, Ayana is asking quite rightly, so how is it as a white person, this has never been something you've questioned? Well, that's because we have become conditioned to, this is what the world is like, right? The world doesn't deliver equality or justice. The transatlantic slave trade has habituated us to exploitation. And this is what whiteness is built on. But this is how, and you can insert your own word here, your own swear word about this, but this is how screwed up whiteness actually is. As I said in my introduction, I could have talked about enslavement in earlier years as if the British were responsible for abolition. This is how screwed up the psyche is, because of the profit and how we are bought off by it. That's part of the cost, I think, to share a very small cost in that respect. But it's that normalizing of racism and inequality and how that then floods into so many other areas, so many other people, so many other human beings made in the divine image of God, who can therefore just be written off. As David Cameron said, get over it. And as the Duke of Cambridge in his visit to Jamaica has been saying, it's a great shame. We are profoundly sorry. It should never have happened. Part of the cost of the transatlantic slave trade, I think, especially as a person of faith and a person of Christian organization, an officer of Christianity and white European British Christianity, is the way that a supremacist, imperial, colonial faith normalizes itself and is therefore able to emphasize forgiveness on the part of the victim rather than repentance on the behalf of the perpetrator. And so I don't think I have time to share with you, but there is this beautiful artwork of a British Nigerian artist, Yinka Shonabare, and let me share it just quickly. And here is King Henry VIII and Queen Elizabeth I, the great symbols of the beginning of the transatlantic slave trade in British history, Tudor queens, Tudor kings, and they are displayed here in cloth stolen from Africa. And there's underlining the point that others have shared about the way in which Europe, Britain, has been aggrandized by African wealth. And the descendants of these people are still saying, we are very sorry about it. but it's time to put money where mouths are, of course. And to hear again in the context of Jesus College in Cambridge, the memorial to a slave trader, Tobias Rustad. Now, the Archbishop of Canterbury appealed for this memorial to be taken down, but a church court has refused. And in their explanation, they said, to be honest, he wasn't a very successful slave trader. He made his money from other things. Therefore, you, the master of the college, who is black and a black academic, should just put up with it. So in addition to whatever guilt that must rightly be expressed, by white people like myself, is to reach that point of rage about how this can be. And that we don't bring that is itself part of the cost borne, as Ayana has been testifying, and others here. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you. Let's now hear from Marilia, please. What would be your responses to this question around the cumulative cost?
I would like to start answering this question by mentioning the fact that the history of slavery in Brazil and in many countries in Latin America, the number of enslaved persons that are brought to Brazil and the descendants of those enslaved persons are at the moment about 110 million people in Brazil. We have 56% of the Brazilian population are people of African descent. And what is the cumulative cost of that? So I would like to mention some elements. And the abolition of slavery in the country did not guarantee the incorporation, the integration of African descent peoples as citizens. So the abolition of slavery, in fact, left the people away from the plantations and the places where they worked, and the situation became a greater abandonment and poverty and second-class citizenship and grave economic situations. And also, we can mention a very, very precarious condition, economic and political as well condition. When we look out to the peripheries of the cities in Brazil, and I'm sure in many other countries in Latin America, the majority of those living in poverty today are still African descent people in the big cities and the small cities and all places where African descent people are living in. In Brazil, we have not had a segregation by law, but we do have a de facto segregation in all aspects as it relates to economics, as it relates to access to education, as it relates to low-skilled jobs, informal occupations, and the precariousness and job instability of African descent population in the country. So those are very, very clear cumulative costs. There is institutional racism so alive and operating in the country in a way that the majority of the society very often do not recognize that the present situation of African descent in Brazil is a consequence of the history of slavery, but also a consequence of the way the abolition of slavery happened in this country. So they never, the government at the time never did anything really to integrate and to make possible the growing and the development of the African descent population. And I would like to, two last elements I wanted to mention. One of them is the violence against young men of African descent in Brazil. We have one of the largest rates of death of young people under 24 in the country. So the police brutality and the violence of drug traffic and so on is rampant in many parts of the country. And one last element I would like to highlight is we inherit the wealth of religiousness of African descent peoples that came, the Africans that came to Brazil. So the reality of African religions in Brazil is very present, not only in Brazil, in Colombia, in Cuba, and many other countries in Latin America. And we are still living under the very serious situations of religious intolerance. And when I speak about religious intolerance, I am referring to violence in many respects. Places of worship that are burned down, the element of fundamentalism. So where the importance of the struggle for religious freedom is one very, very crucial element. Discrimination and violence against people of African descent, and especially people of African religions, is a crucial element in the Brazilian context.
Thank you, Marilia. Thank you very much. For this same question, we'll finally hear from Karen Georgia around your thoughts around the cost, the cumulative cost, please.
Well, I would say ditto to everything that has already been said. And I would say take out your calculator and start thinking about cost in that way as well. My name is Karen Georgia Antoinette Thompson. I was born in Kingston, Jamaica, to parents who were the descendants of enslaved people. They were, I think between both of my parents, they probably had a 5th grade education, products of a colonial system that undereducated Black children. There's a cost there, so add that to your calculator. I would also name that as has been named by so many, and I think really expounded by Ayana, the lack of identity has a cost that we cannot quantify. Years ago, I spent $59 to do a DNA test to discover that my ancestors came from Nigeria, Sierra Leone, Ghana, and Kenya. That also is a price beyond the $59 to then think of what it is that I have lost in not knowing about heritage and culture and how to self-identify beyond being born in Jamaica, which has a context and has a place to name, but I am more than that in my identity. I am an African descendant person whose ancestors came from the continent. A cost, a price, illiteracy, lack of identity. Let me also name the fact that we also need to count the cost of those who have been paid. Peter has alluded to the complicity of the British government and the part of the British in the transatlantic slave trade. What is not often discussed are the billions of dollars that were paid to slave owners upon emancipation of enslaved people in the British colonies. Give the money back. That's money that you took from people, from Black people. Give the money that you borrowed from the treasury back to Black people. let me also account for the $21 billion that the French took from Haiti. For years, the Haitians paid reparations because they dared to claim and take their freedom from the French. The French made them pay reparations. And as a result, actively participated in the underdevelopment of an entire nation of people that we continue in the Americas to vilify because of their Blackness, because of their retention of their religion, and because they dared to say, we are African people, we will retain our Africanness, we will practice our voodoo, we will practice our Christianity. This is who we are. Give them their money back. The $300 per person that were given to slave owners in Washington, D.C., give the money back. The trauma that you have caused us to ingest, send us to therapy and give us the money back. So let's talk about a cumulative cost. These are monies that can never be repaid. But what I'm saying is, if we're going to talk about the cost, yes, we can talk about the trauma. Yes, we can talk about the violence we're ingesting. Yes, we can talk about the fact that we're in so many different shades as Black people because they raped our men and our women. Give us the money back and give us our freedom while you're at it, because we're not a free people, and that has a price and a cost. And while I'm at it in this Christian context, Christians, we need to own our complicity in this as well. Slave ships were blessed. The church needs to be present in offering an apology to enslaved people for the wrong that the church did. Bibles were present in naming Black people as demonic and lacking souls. Give us the money back. Send us to therapy. Give us what we need. Develop our countries. Provide the infrastructure that was needed. The wealth and resources that were stolen and taken, give it back. There is an overarching cost here that needs to be told in this story. We cannot sit and name countries in Europe and not speak to the complicity of the church and the fact that the church in the Americas allowed enslaved people to sit in their balconies, preached a gospel when they chose to, that caused people to believe that the place that they owned as chattel was somehow justified by God. We need to dismantle that theological nonsense that has been perpetuated, because that too has a cost. Thanks for showing up, Adele. I am done.
Thank you, Karen Georgia, and thank you to all of our panelists. I think we have heard about the cumulative cost. In many ways, we have heard, this is the question again, what has been the cumulative cost of the slave trade in Africa and people of African descent? We have heard the ways in which racism has been normalized. We have heard the human cost in many different ways. We've heard about the impact on education, illiteracy, on identity. We've heard the church's complicity, and we've heard about the economic cost. We have been hearing about the cost and its effect, its generations, what's needed now. Thank you, panelists. And I think this leads us very well into our third question around reparations. And again, we've been hinting at this in terms of some of the things that need to be given back. But this next question is around reparations. Friends, what would we say in response to this question? Reparations, restorative justice, or repairing justice? Who or what needs repairing? Who or what must assume the repairing, and what form must the repairing take? So again, I know we've been talking about this a little bit already, but let's go a little further, more in depth in terms of this question of reparation. What is needed in terms of the reparations? So let's first start with Ayanna, please. Ayanna, what would you name in terms of reparations, your response to that question?
First of all, I want to thank Reverend Dr. Karen Georgia. It's simple. If I were to give a short answer to the question to reparations, give the money back. Give it back. But I'm a lawyer, so, you know, when we talk about restorative justice, you have to collect evidence and you have to establish a case. The first response I want to give is that it is absolute nonsense to ask Black people to justify why they need reparations, because we have a legal precedent for reparations. French people claimed reparations, British people claimed reparations, and let's not forget the Spanish and the Dutch who claimed reparations in Guyana when they basically said 1600, sugar is no longer productive, we've made enough money, we're out. They got reparations. So the first thing we need to establish for everybody who doesn't understand is that you shouldn't be asking us a legal question to justify reparations, because you have set a legal precedent for it. So not only is it just, it is right and it is fair because you have done damage. And in law, there's all kinds of ways that you do reparations, right? Negligence in law is about doing reparations. Personal injury law is about doing reparations. So this nonsensical question that has been going around, whereas the Caribbean community that's you know, advocating for reparations, we have to justify to the British, French, Spanish, and Dutch why we need reparations. Absolute rubbish legal argument, absolutely rubbish. The question that often comes up then is, the restorative justice question is, should we be getting money? First of all, there is nothing that any white person, no, even if we were able to go back to the past, go Black to the future, there's nothing they could do to repay us. So this is not about the money, because there is absolutely no cost to disrupting and disorienting people for 400 years, as Eric has said, disorientation, there's absolutely no cost. But hear what? We have legal precedent that says when you do damage, the money is essentially a symbol that you are taking responsibility for the harm that you have caused. So yes, Caricom and all the countries need to have money back, because there is money that went to the Treasury of Britain, there is money that went to the Treasury of France and everywhere else that represents money that they took from free labor people and from their people. So I'm going to respond simply by saying the argument that, you know, we must justify reparation, rubbish. There's legal precedent for it for hundreds of years, as long as we have known and understand what justice means. And secondly, yes, we absolutely need money back. So nobody should be saying to us, oh, but we can't give you money. Like, who would we give it to? Give it to the people who are descendant peoples. There is also precedent for that. There's precedent all around the various, you know, international best practices. Just, I'm not going to name names, because the other thing they do to us is that when we start naming atrocities, they say, oh, but yours isn't as much. So they start, you know, they create a whole legal conversation about, oh, your atrocity isn't equal to, so therefore, why are you arguing that? So we need money back. And there are also practical reparatory things that need to happen. Our people need to go to therapy, right? So if you don't want to give us money back, all of this supposed aid that is coming, allow us to decide what we are going to do with that aid. Don't tell us what to do with the aid. Don't attach strings to the aid. We will take the aid and send our people to therapy. Guyana is in a mental health crisis right now, especially among young Black men and women who can't afford mental health care. If the Duke and Duchess of Cambridge are really sorry and shameful for what happened in the past. Sell a couple of the things that the queen has when she has dinner. Sell a couple of those trinkets and give us the money so that I could do mental health care, right? For the young man who walks into my office, who got injured at work, says to me, his mother died when he was 17, his father is nowhere to be found, and somewhere in the US, he's unemployed, right? He's trying to get a house lot. And he goes to the agency, and the agency says to him, oh, the document that you're presenting is fake. And he can't really argue with them because here why? He can't read the document because he's illiterate. But what he isn't is non-courageous, because he shows up and he says to me, Mr. McCalman, I'm going to apply a house lot. I said, all right, I can do the affidavit for you. And I wrote the affidavit, and then I read it to him. So we need money back so that we could do practical things like giving people, supporting people like that young man who I just mentioned, who need public assistance. I'm with Karen. Give us the money back. There's no legal justification for holding on to it. You have precedent set in your laws that you gave us. Give us the money back.
Thank you, Ayana. Thank you. Let's now hear from Eric. What would you name in response to the question of reparations?
Tricky questions. When it comes up, then you have people trying to explain it away. I normally organize tours to the Cape Coast Castle and Elmina castles in Ghana. Once we had a Norwegian tourist, and then we had an African-American tourist together going on the same tour. When we got to the female dungeon, and they explained how people were packed into it and what happened, and you can still see the spots of blood in the dungeon. The Norwegian tourist said, oh, so I am white, this is what our people did. Very sorry for such a thing, but who is to blame? Well, and who is to pay for all this? Well, per us, those who did it, they are far gone. I am not part of it. That was the Norwegian tourist response to that. Why is the African-American lady just broke down? And you know, people don't realize that the trauma continues. When people visit, we organize tours, when people visit those places, some just collapse. And a lot of things happen. And so it is a continuous thing for the Norwegian tourist to say, who is to blame? As if those who did it are gone, as for us, we are not part of it. So it's a kind of patronizing. People just patronize, especially us in terms of these things. And you know, we have what we call Panafest, where they organize festivals and we have people from the diaspora coming in. And then I realized also that some white people also join in. And now I realize that instead of talking about reparation, instead of talking about real repentance, instead of talking about how we can do these things, it has become more of an entertainment than really talking about how to deal with the key issues. So I would say that it is important to really look at the thing in its face and look at how this has to be repaired. You can't just be so paternalistic about patronizing about it and fantasize it and make people feel, oh, it's not good, as Peter said. But if it is not good, how do we correct it? I think for me, that is the thing. I also want to talk about the fact that there should be real talking about even making some attempts to pay back, not just sitting there and saying, oh, it's okay, it has to be paid back. Pay something back. Then also the church. The church was involved. I have never gone to a church service where they have talked about the slave trade and the harm the church was involved in causing. and churches benefited very greatly. In Ghana, for instance, there is a very important church leader who participated in the slave trade. He was in the 14th, 15th century. He was a key person around the time, and he was a mulatto, and he was supposed to help the gospel to go, but he was a slave owner. Carl Randolph, he wrote the history of Ghana. If you go, and he's a slave owner, and he's in the church, and he participated in the church so strongly. The church is so silent about reparation and repentance, and that is in their books. I remember they organized what they call the Joseph Project to Ghana. The Joseph Project was supposed to help the church to center the either issue of reparation, but the church never took it so seriously in our context. So I believe that the church and also our society, our communities that participated in this should really be made to pay something back. And I think they can do so because they've been doing it, as we have said. So it shouldn't be just emancipation in terms of celebration and entertainment, but it should be a reparation and a restoration, which should be looked at. So because this emancipation thing, I don't think it has helped a lot. Emancipation without restoration is empty. Thank you.
Thank you, Eric. Thank you very much. Let's hear now from Peter what your responses would be in relation to the question of reparations.
Thank you, Adele. A few things I wanted to share arising really from the work that Council for World Mission is doing, trying to address legacies of slavery in our history and story, and owning this sinfulness and this profit in those two ways, and the racism that we propagated and developed in order to recruit missionaries and to make money. So first of all, I want to at least make a mild comment, I suppose, that to acknowledge that reparation, whilst it's difficult and controversial, there are lots of signs that it is happening. And so it's really important that in our kind of advocacy of reparation, that we keep pointing to the ways that this fundamentally creates change. And in recent events, where we looked at some anti-racism work between World Council of Churches, C2M and others, we emphasize this: apology is not enough, money is not enough, though it is welcome and needed. Only change is enough. And that's the key point, I think, about what reparation begins to create in a way that apology does not. So in the context of my own organization, facing up to this history and struggling very painfully because we are not that organization anymore. We're a post-colonial organization made up of the leadership of churches from all around the world. But as we reflect on this in our story and move from acknowledgement to confession, to repentance, to consider what does reparation look like. So I'm going to read to you one of the statements, if you like, that's at the kind of names, I suppose, elements of how at least we are trying to understand this. So we will repent of the historic and continuing endemic economic exploitation of the poor today and the sins of racism in our life today. We will return resources to empower those people and communities sinned against through racism and economic exploitation. We will reject the historic and endemic privileges afforded by racism and economic exploitation in our life today, and we will disrupt the historic and endemic structures of economic exploitation and racism. We will inspire other ecumenical partners with compromised histories like ours into the Christ-led struggle for transformation through reparation, racial justice, and equity. We will create communities which resist racism and enslavement and honor the image of God in all people, and we will arise with those leading the work for reparation and system change. So reparation needs to point in those directions, in these ways. That's what we are trying to say, I guess, even as we struggle towards it. that reparation can begin to create the mechanisms for all of this repayment and rebuilding. The vision of Zacchaeus, of course, in the way that that works as a way to build change in our world now and enable those who have been exploited over 400 years to recover. And I think this then is at the heart of how we need to continue to advocate this, because it isn't enough to apologize. We are hearing in the kind of wider world since George Floyd and all of those events in the US and beyond, that there is a desire to address this, and churches have to be key and vocal in pressing us to move beyond the rhetoric that Leander has named in our questions, and the piety, the kind of intergenerational fantasia that whiteness suffers from, and all the churches that have been created out of whiteness suffer from, that we move from emphasizing the forgiveness that victims need to give and emphasize the repentance that perpetrators need to make and demonstrate authentically. So that's a key part of the struggle that this conversation is already naming, and this movement of ecumenical space in terms of the World Council of Churches and others needs to keep open and, you know, as powerfully and passionately as Karen, Georgia, and Ayana, and Maria, and all of us are trying to name. So that much, at least, the context of rhetoric of an organization moving towards this, struggling towards this, is how we want to kind of shape and name this.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you very much for sharing your perspectives on this question of reparations. Let's now hear from Karen, Georgia. What would you have to say about reparations, repair, restoration?
Thank you. And I just want to just receive all the comments that have been made prior as well. I think that, and Peter, I just want to thank you for what you laid out in your remarks as well. I think that one of the challenges here is relational. We are people occupying this planet, and harm has been done to many people groups, including this one. Ayana ably named the precedents that have been set in identifying multiple communities that have received repair and restitution for harm that was done in communities. And those communities were also allowed to determine how restitution that was paid was then disseminated around and in those communities. We are a significantly large group of people. According to the United Nations, there are over 200 million people of African descent, primarily in the Americas. That's 200 million people who are descendants of enslaved people. So an apology is a start. I find that in our, particularly when we talk about this in the church, we begin to talk about questions of forgiveness. And I don't think that this is a conversation about forgiveness, and because forgiveness is given from those who have been wronged to those who have perpetuated wrongs. So I don't think forgiveness is on the table at this point in any context. I think that with the apology is an acknowledgement, and I don't think we get to repentance without acknowledgement. So being able to name, and I think that, you know, the church, European communities need to name the wrongs that they have done. I think that there is so much focus around money and power in this, that there is an overshadowing of what it has meant to people of African descent to have their human rights and dignity repeatedly disrupted and disregarded in the shadows of a narrative of enslavement and the dehumanization and denigration of people. A. B. I want to point to the Caricom reparations plan. And I always, and Ayanna actually noted Caricom. And I see that it's also in the chat. The Caricom 10-point plan is pretty comprehensive. It's certainly not the only one out there, but it begins to talk not just about restitution, but about building infrastructure around sustainable development issues. It also includes questions and issues around Indigenous rights, knowledge recovery. So it's one of those that I tend to look at. There's the question, they also raise repatriation for those who want to. It notes the current public health crisis. Ayanna alluded to that, with also the mental health crisis that is facing many of our African descendant communities. Illiteracy. You know, I grew up in a time, and it's also very present, where things that are African are demonized. We talk about Africa in ways that problematize a continent and a people as a way of elevating whiteness and a European-centered way of being. And when we talk about decentering whiteness, there's an investment to be made. And I believe if we really want to get back to this question of repairing relationships and being in right relations, then we need to be willing to invest in the work that needs to be done as a reparatory justice program, right? So when we talk about who and what needs repairing, there's the relational piece. I would say that there needs to be a repairing of what truth is, because there are ways in which our stories are told that are lies. And so the comprehensive history of what has transpired over the last 400 years plus also needs to be a part of what is repaired. And when we talk about restorative justice, these pieces also need to be in place. What form must the repairing take? One, like I said, the relational piece. We're talking about this in context of the church. The church needs to begin to do new theologies that begin to undo things like apartheid theology, Jim Crow theology, enslavement theology. We could go through, and there are all these places where whiteness has been perpetuated. A part of reparatory justice has to include focus around the theologies that have emerged. We've noted also the ways in which the church profited. And so, you know, it's much of what I've said before, but I think that this idea of repair needs to be a two-way street. And I think it also needs to be in conversation with communities of color that have been wronged. I don't think that it is appropriate for white communities to say, this is what we're going to give you, because when you say this is what we want to give you, this may not be what we need. So the conversation about what communities need to build infrastructure, to listen to the truth of what has happened, to ingest and understand that truth and the traumas that it has created, is a part of what is needed if we say that what we want is repair, because repair requires restitution. And restitution means that we're putting people back to where they would have been if their lives had not been disrupted.
Amazing. Thank you, Karen, Georgia. Thank you. Finally, let's hear from Marilia, please, your responses to this question around reparations.
Adele, what I wanted to say is that I am totally grateful to Karen, Georgia, to Ayana, to Eric and Peter, in every step of the way that they have shared. I mean, I believe they were very comprehensive in so many ways in terms of reparations and reparatory justice. So I do not have as much to compliment in the areas they have covered so well so far. Well, what I wanted to highlight is that two elements particularly, is that one, the negative one, that in Brazil, we have never had any process of reparatory justice or reparations, neither for slavery, nor after the abolition of slavery. So that is not a reality that we have gone through as a country. So then when I hear all the elements that my colleagues before me have outlined, it seems so relevant for our reality, what they have shared. What we had in Brazil is a process of affirmative action, a process of affirmative action that covered especially elements related to education, to access to university for African descendants, as well as indigenous peoples. So in this process also, a concern for a critical analysis and review of racist ideologies in the curricula and textbooks that are used in public schools and as well as in private schools. So this is just one element that I want to highlight of what we have experienced in terms of our Brazilian reality. And yet the issue of affirmative action that here in Brazil oftentimes was called quotas to university was, there was a lot of opposition, to say lightly, in many, many respects with regards to that. But it's very clear that the impact that it has in the lives of people of African descent, the opportunity for education, the opportunity for jobs, and that makes a change in everyday life. But I wanted to again underline the importance of all the elements that my colleagues here have highlighted before me, and to say that reparatory justice, reparations is a must in terms of our societies and in terms of how we are going to address issues of poverty, of marginalization, of situations that we have named here so clearly. So I think my sincere thanks to every one of my colleagues before me that so well have outlined the importance of this issue of reparations and reparatory justice. I thank you very, very much to each and every one.
Thank you, Marilia, and thank you to all of our panelists for responding so fully to this question of reparations, restorative justice, or repairing justice. Who or what needs repairing, who must assume they're repairing, and what form must the repairing take? And we've heard a great deal. We've heard around the church's complicity, the need for the church to take responsibility, in particular because the church has caused harm and people in the church have benefited. We've heard in particular of the descendants of slave owners. We've heard of the need for an apology, and that an apology alone is not enough. We've heard around the need for money to give money back and that money alone is not enough. We've heard of the need for systemic change to repair relationships, to continue to work on dismantling systemic racism, to challenge whiteness, for truth-telling, for new theologies, that all of this is part of the change that's needed, a part of the action. So the reparations is also action. So it's a combination of many things: giving the money back, apologies, action, systemic change, and more. We've also heard that this collective conversation is not an abstract one. It lives on in many of us. It's an emotional and traumatic reality. It's one that needs, has mental health effects, intergenerational trauma, and much more. So it's a live conversation. It's not an abstract conversation of something that happened years ago. It's live in our present reality in terms of the legacies of slavery and how it affects people of African descent in particular, but people of all racial identities. In a moment, we'll move towards a question and answer period. Again, we've heard a lot already in terms of this conversation, and yet there are questions that are emerging for further conversations. So I'm going to put the questions that have emerged so far into the chat. I've been receiving some individually. Some people have been noting them to me. So let me just put these in the chat for our conversation, and any of our panelists can take these in any order that you would like. So I'll just read some of them out for reflection. So some of the first ones that we received are, what are some things that individuals and churches might do to continue to work towards equality? A question around forced labor in Kenya and Uganda in the British colonial times. A question in terms of Haiti, noting that Haiti is bearing a brunt of much of what we've been talking about. And so might there be some comments on that? A few more questions. I'm going to put them all in the chat, and then I'll invite any of our panelists to respond in any order. Another question in terms of if Africans have realized the impact of the slave trade and racism, what might this mean in terms of a land of plenty? A question of what's non-negotiable in terms of reparations. So is reparation a non-negotiable? And when we talk about transformation, how might reparation be not just a demonstration, but a final demonstration of transformation? And a last question around really around dismantling power structures. So what might be some concrete definitive actions, strategies that we might bring about? So those are a number of questions that have been posed during the course of this conversation. I think we'll open it up to all of the panelists. You can respond to any question that you would like in any order, maybe one that has some particular resonance for you as we move towards the end of our time together. So over to you, panelists. And if anyone has additional questions to ask, please feel free to put them in the chat.
With permission, may I begin with a response to one of the questions? So I'm particularly interested in the question around the things that individuals and churches can do. I believe that in the spirit of Harriet Tubman, who I name, we all need to do our individual freedom project. In our minds, so I think we need, first of all, as an African descendant person, I can't speak to a white person's experience because I'm not in a white skin. So my response is to the people who look like me. I believe we all need to do our own freedom project. So all of us need to get off the plantation, whatever our plantations look like, our jobs, our belief systems. We need to take responsibility to do that work on an individual level to get off the plantation. Bob Marley said, emancipate yourself from mental slavery, because nobody but yourself can free your mind. I think that's a lifelong individual work that each of us have to be committed to. In terms of what churches can do, as Reverend Karen said, we need to change the theological conversations we're having. Peter said it, and actually before he said it, I said, this is confirmation, because I wrote it down. But I actually, the scripture from Zacchaeus came to me, right? And it says, Luke 19:8, but Zacchaeus stood up and said to the Lord, look, Lord, here and now, I give half of my possessions to the poor. And if I have cheated anybody out of anything, I will pay back 4 times the amount. What the Bible doesn't say is whether or not he actually did that, but I want to hope that Zacchaeus was a short man, but a man who wasn't short of integrity, and that he actually, when he said to the Lord that he was going to do it, he did it. But I'm pointing out the Zacchaeus passage to say, you know, reparations has a biblical context. Zacchaeus basically committed to do reparations. He said, if I've cheated anyone, I'm going to pay back 4 times. I am not a theological scholar, so I don't know why they said if, because I suspect Zacchaeus really meant, you know, I did cheat and I'm going to pay it back because he was a tax collector. I don't know who inserted if. I'm a lawyer, not a theologian, so I wouldn't even get involved in that conversation. But I think it's important for us to begin to have conversations about Zacchaeus and reparations. And I believe it was either Peter or Eric who said the church needs to break its silence. You're either for reparations or you're not. I don't believe there's a middle ground. There's a place for silence. Like, you have to, even not having a choice is a choice. So I think that's where the church needs to start. The silence and just telling people to forgive and not being involved in the reparations conversation. You just need, either you're participating in it or you're not. And I guess the final thing I want to say quickly is the legal element. I'm a lawyer by training. I've been a lawyer for 16 years, and I have decided, I was listening to a speech from MLK in 1965 to UCLA, and he talks about the role of law. And he says, you know, the law, while the law can't regulate morality, it can't prevent people from being heartless. It could restrain the heartless. So I've committed to be a lawyer for the rest of my life until the day I die. And for me, the law has an important place to play, and that's what I'm committing to do my part. And those who are lawyers on the chat or no lawyers on the chat, like, we need to encourage our lawyers to do the same, because this all started with a body of law. I was also looking up the Emancipation Act, and interestingly enough, the Emancipation Act starts with subject to all the other conditions. So they freed us, but whoever drafted the legislation, I'm going to research it after I get off the chat. Somebody decided to write, okay, y'all are free, but this freedom is, right? And I have worked in the Attorney General's chambers. I know, as a state solicitor, I have good memories of the people who are draftspeople. And I have good relationships with them. So I know something about legislative drafting, and they're very precise. They don't make mistakes. They're the group of people who are very conscious of the words they use, because this has an economic effect. And somebody decided to free us in a piece of legislation, but started off the legislation with subject to all conditions. I'll stop there for now, but yeah.
Thank you, Ayanna. Thank you. Let's hear from our other panelists. Karen, Georgia, any responses to the questions that have been emerged so far, and also any closing remarks that you might want to make?
Thank you. And thank you for your moderation for today, Adele. I just wanted to respond to the question that was raised in the Q&A chat, because there's also a Q&A chat in addition to the regular chat. And the question is about dismantling the Babylons and power structures of the world, and what are the concrete definitive actions or strategies we can bring to bear, the advocacy that would ultimately undermine these power structures, etc. And I just want to speak to that because I think that as people of African descent, we don't have a comprehensive narrative. And what that means is that we are unable to tell our collective stories. And that has added an element of divide and conquer when we talk about a movement for reparatory justice and for restitution, both for Africans and African descendant people. And I think Eric alluded to this when he talked about the visit to Elmina, and the question of who's responsible, and this idea where those of us who ended up as descendants of enslaved people have been taught to put the blame on Africans for selling us, right? Because the truth is that Africa was also colonized, and especially when we talk about sub-Saharan Africa, that there was colonization there as well, and also the enslavement of people. And that when I can speak to the British, because that's where I come from, that when the British emancipated, they emancipated not just in the Americas, they emancipated on the African continent as well, and in other parts of the world. And I call that first emancipation because for many of our countries, second emancipation came in the 1960s with independence, right? Because we weren't quite free. Then they gave us independence. And I want to say that there needs to be a third emancipation in this as well. But this question, I think, about advocacy is really about finding those ways where, as we do our own local movements for reparations in our own context. I live in the United States, and I am all about HR 40 and the reparations movement in the United States, right? But as an immigrant to this country, I have one foot here, but I'm also very knowledgeable about what Caricom is asking for in the Caribbean and why. And I'm availing myself about what the Africa Union is calling for as well in terms of reparations and reparatory justice, because all these things are tied together. And if we are not knowledgeable across the spectrum, it doesn't mean that you have to be an expert. It means that wherever you live, you need to be able to say, and this is what is happening in this other place, and this is how it connects to who I am and what I'm asking for. So what Canadians are asking for, what people in the United States are asking for, what people in Brazil, in the CARICOM countries, what we're all asking for is really the same thing. We're asking that restitution be paid. We're asking that equity be a part of this conversation to level a playing field that has been stacked against people because we have not had the historic investments that allow us to inherit wealth generationally, which is what we're talking about. So when that white person stands in Elmina and says, well, I don't owe anything, actually you do, because there's something to be said about generational wealth that has passed from one generation to another. And there are those who are doing the work. University of Central London is one, City College in New York is another. And what they're doing is they're tracking the wealth that has been amassed from the enslavement of people. And we need to be able to hold those places as a part of our advocacy and speak to the communal ways in which we have been affected, and not just country by country or ethnic group by ethnic group. This is a collective.
Thank you, Karen Georgia. Thank you. Let's see, Peter, Eric, or Marilia, would you have any responses to any of the questions? Just a couple minutes each, please.
Yes, Adele. This is Eric. Yeah. I said the question about what are the non-negotiables in terms of reparation, and when you look at the issue of reparation, people can easily run away from it because we can make it very abstract, or we can make it a very difficult thing to do, and then we move away from it, or we can spiritualize it, kind of. But I feel that there are some gaps that need to be filled, and when we try filling the gaps, we will do reparation. For instance, when I taught at Kennesaw State University, my co-lecturer who I was lecturing with in heritage, African heritage, was a white American. Then he said to me, "I'm taking you to a Black church." So Sunday, he took me to a Black church in Atlanta. He dropped me at the door. Then I went into the church. When we finished the church, they took me to a Black restaurant in Atlanta. Then he called, he said, "Have you finished?" I said, "I've finished." Then he came to pick me. Then we went back to the campus. And I was saying, the next week he took me to his church, which is a completely white church. So there are gaps to be filled. I think that there's a need for a deep conversation about what happened, and specifically name certain things that need to be done. One is there's a need for the realization of our common humanity that needs to be respected. And there should be ways of expressing it very practically. It is very important because, for instance, when we talk about the slave trade, there were white people who also were sent to go and buy slaves for the slave masters and other things. And because of the climatic situation, they also died. A lot of white people were sent just for the sake of profit by slave masters, and they also died when you read the story. And then in some situations, they brought others who are stronger. They even brought mulattoes who can stand the climate. The issue was profit and not persons. That is the issue. And I think we need to address that as a people, to say, if people went for profit and not for persons, it is wrong. And if it is wrong, how do we recover our common humanity in terms of making sure that we repair what is done and move on to refine our common, because there was the disrespect for death and people dying. And this is something which has continued. It's not only Blacks, but whites. So the non-negotiable thing is the recovery of our common humanity. It needs to be respected. And to respect that, you need to do something to show that you are intentionally repairing it.
Thank you, Eric. Let's hear maybe briefly from Peter, and then briefly from Marilia, and then we'll move towards closing remarks.
Just very briefly, I think listening again to Ayana earlier, speaking about Zacchaeus, which community in our world understands what repentance and reparation is? So we have a message to any churches who are here listening, any leaders of churches who are engaging in this work. Hurry up. You understand this. This is your spirit. This is your discipleship we are talking about. Who else gets this? Why do we need to advocate this so hard that you don't listen? Do this, because then our witness creates a platform that we can then go to these other powers and say, see, this is the truth. We understand this. This is our calling. This is our discipleship. This is what Christ does and has been doing because and through Ayana, Marilia, Eric, Karen Georgia, and Adele since before they were born. listen, and change. This is our story. This is who we are.
Thank you, Peter. Marilia.
Thank you very much, Adele, and thank you very much to all of you. To listen to you is so, it gave me so many insights and understandings, and I really appreciate very much. And what I take away with me from our conversation here together is it is very clear when I look around and in the context of the Brazilian society, how much we still need to work in understanding together how we as African descent people in Brazil would move forward in terms of the reparation process. I think there is a movement in the country, the Black movement is reflecting upon it. Certain sectors of our society are doing that, but is still a very incipient, is the beginning of a process in terms of reparations process. So I think the reflections we have had here helped me to understand how much of that we still need to do. And the second element I wanted to raise is with regards to churches and church communities. Definitely in the Christian community. And there is a whole work to be done and reflections to be done and analysis to be done in terms of restorative justice. I think those two areas, both in society and in churches and church communities, I think there is an awareness raising is still to be done in our context. There is studies to be done in our context. So by saying those, bringing those elements, what I'm saying is that we have a work to do. We have a process to go through in terms of how we can join together in this reparation movement. And finally, just to say that I'm totally agree with Karen, and I think Ayana also mentioned that, is that the reparation process is a worldwide process, and we need to join together our forces as African descent people. I think I heard all of you saying that, and for me, that is a crucial element, that together we will be stronger. Together we will be able to achieve something greater than we would do individually in our own countries. So there is a task to be done in our countries, but there is a task to be done as a collective in terms of African descent world community for reparations. So this is what I would like to say, and to thank very much everyone here. It was very rich. It is very rich, our conversation.
Thank you, Marilia, and thank you to all of our panelists. Thank you, Eric, Karen Georgia, Marilia, Ayana, and Peter for this very full and rich conversation. Thank you, thank you, thank you for all that you have shared during this time. Friends, collectively, and thank you to all of our the participants who have been here. I hope that in this conversation, you have been inspired and challenged and provoked and prodded, and that collectively, as we've heard, there might be a call to action. So that is our hope and prayer, and that this conversation will continue in many other ways. We are coming close to the end of our time, so I'm just going to pass it back to Masiwa and Isabel for some closing remarks as we end this time. So thank you, everyone, once again.
Good. So we have now reached the end of our online webinar on community, church, state, and economics of enslavement, views from across the Atlantic. As we said at the beginning, this is part of our commemoration of the UN International Day for the Remembrance of Victims of Slavery and the Transatlantic Slave Trade. Starting from the opening prayer, that was offered by my colleague, Masiwa, up to the summary and highlights of the moderator, it has been an inspiring remembrance. We have remembered those who died because of the slave trade. And we have also remembered those who survived and experienced inhuman treatment by their colonial masters. We have remembered those Africans on the continent and Africans in the diaspora who still suffer from the damages caused by slave trade. We will continue to calculate the accumulative cost of slavery and demand reparation and restoration. That's the strong message that has come from this webinar. And I want to emphasize that this conversation is not only for this group. We must make it to be part of the conversation of the broader ecumenical movement, making our common witness and actions in the world stronger than ever. We will take this conversation to the WCC 11th Assembly. On behalf of all participants of this webinar, I want to extend our heartfelt thanks again to our speakers, to Karen, to Mariria, Ayana, Eric, and Peter. You have spoken with passion. Your passion is contagious. We have heard your challenging message and call for action. To the moderator, Adele, thank you for your excellent moderation. You kept the conversation lively. I also want to extend our deep thanks to my colleague, Masiwa, and those who worked with him to plan for this webinar. It is because it was well planned that it has been successful in its implementation. And special thanks to Marcelo from our WCC communication and the interpreters. I'm thinking of Maria Berry, Anne-Claire, Giselle, and Vincent. You made it possible for us to understand each other despite the different languages we speak. And finally, a big thanks to all of you who have participated in this conversation. You have participated through your questions and through your comments, as well as just listening to the conversation. So I wish you all a good rest and relaxing weekend. God bless you all.